that materialism is the truth, materialism is the answer. So what I thought I would do, I mean, with that sort of, is a very long introduction. I thought I'd pick three big issues that the law has been struggling with, really perennially, but certainly in the last several decades in particular, to sort of bring out the conflicts, the dilemmas that we face. Let me start with freedom. And I mean freedom in the sense of internal freedom. Freedom in the sense of a human choice, of having choice, of being able to say in some robust way, I did this, but I could have done that. That's something determinists can't really say without playing around a lot with the word could have. But I want to talk about that. In the criminal law, we see the development, I guess really the influence of the creeping determinism of our age in lots of criminal law excuses that are, again, becoming more popular, more manifest. I took a look at some cases several months ago in the literature on criminal excuse, and there are literally somewhere between 40 and 50 new defenses. And they're mind-boggling. There are defenses related to pornography, defenses related to eating Twinkies, premenstrual distress, postpartum distress. I could go on. I wish I'd read the list again before doing the talk, because some of them are quite funny. But the point is, we're moving in this direction, and yet the criminal law is very much grounded in the traditional assumption that human beings are free and responsible. That we make choices and that we are responsible for the consequences under normal circumstances. In 1924, there was a famous case involving Leopold and Loeb. Leopold and Loeb, how many of you have heard of this case? Leopold and Loeb grew up on the south side of Chicago, near the University of Chicago. They were 17 and 18 years old. They were both brilliant. Leopold was already at that age in the second year of law study at the University of Chicago. He was an expert at the I'm going to forget the term for being an expert in bees. Anybody remember being a beekeeper? Is it? Yeah, I thought there was is that? Yeah. He would lecture to professional associations at 18 about this. I mean, he was undoubtedly brilliant. And Loeb was an athlete, also incredibly bright. Both were brought up in upper-class homes, again, near the University of Chicago. At any rate, the two of them concocted the idea of getting away with the perfect murder. And there was a neighbor boy by the name of Robert Franks, who was about 3 or 4 years younger than they were, and he was mentally disabled, slightly mentally disabled. I think today we'd say mildly mentally retarded. But he looked up to both of these boys. They were neighbors, their families had dined together. So Leopold and Loeb picked up Franks from school one day and said, "Would you like a ride?" And he said, yes. He was delighted, jumped in the car in the front passenger side seat, and while Loeb drove, Leopold took a hammer to the back of his head and murdered him, and left his naked body in a culvert somewhere west of Chicago, and then went out and had a hearty dinner. Well, they weren't so smart after all, as it turned out. They made some crucial mistakes, which led the police back to them. And ultimately, they were tried. And because their families were wealthy, they retained the services of Clarence Darrow, a very famous lawyer. Darrow was something of a philosopher himself. He was a materialist, an atheist, and took determinism very seriously. In his autobiography, he talks very much about, why would the universe be made in such a way where everything out there happens in cause and effect fashion, but in here there's some choice, there's some space. So Darrow took the case and basically defended Leopold and Lowell, claiming that the two boys were quote-unquote broken machines. And he said in his closing argument, essentially, these boys were determined to do this from the very beginning of time. Their family, their upbringing, determined them to do this. What was novel, I mean, deterministic defenses weren't new. People have been arguing about this for centuries. But what was sort of novel is that for the first time it wasn't some underprivileged person, but two very, very wealthy people, very privileged, educated, brilliant people. And the essence of Darrow's defense was, yes, that is what contributed as a determining factor to their behavior. It was precisely their wealth, their privilege, their education, their genius that made them killers. Well, of course, he was drawing the consequences of the deterministic worldview, right? Because if determinism is true, it doesn't simply apply to the underprivileged or the poor or people who are less intelligent. It applies to everything and to everybody. In that particular case, there was a huge outcry, as you might imagine, and ultimately the judge spared them the death penalty, but they were convicted. So Darrow wasn't quite as successful in that case as he had been in others. But the point that I use the case for is to sort of illustrate the consequences of embracing that particular worldview, the consequences of embracing determinism, and making sense of freedom requires, I argue, a worldview that, well, it's not consistent with or can't be harmonized with the traditional sort of, again, materialistic worldview. So the criminal law is at a point right now, to sort of wrap up this example, is at a point right now where it's attempting to sort of, I don't want to say fuse the two worldviews, because I don't think they can be fused, but looking for a way to rethink the traditional conception of human nature, but in terms that are sensitive to the fact that we do know social and other forces do shape behavior. So, what I think the best criminal law minds of the next generation are going to be doing is unless they give up the ghost of determinism altogether, and that would require us moving in a very different direction in terms of our conceptions of responsibility and punishment. If we don't do that, what the criminal law will have to do is to rethink the traditional metaphor, but again in a way that's sensitive to, that's responsive to what we do know about science and about the causes of people's behavior. But again, it isn't. This is a challenge, I want to say, to those who are thinking through these problems in the future. Another example, second area where very general, I think we're struggling with these ideas, is our concept of human rights. And I won't be quite as long-winded on this one. We want to believe that there are transcendent foundations, in some sense, that when a particular regime does not recognize a right to freedom of speech or liberty of religion or even basic physical liberties, we want to believe that there is something, international lawyers want to believe, that there is some standard by which those regimes can be measured and judged. But again, many of the people who want to believe those things don't have the machinery to do that. They don't believe that there is anything like a worldview that permits for standards independently of the positive standards of particular countries. And of course, that was a great difficulty even in Nuremberg, where our prosecutors were forced with bringing the Nazi Nazi perpetrators, the architects of the Third Reich, to justice, some wanted simply to hang them. Winston Churchill famously said, just hang the lot of them. And the Americans in particular, and Justice Jackson of the Supreme Court, who had gone over there as an allied prosecutor, said, we can't do that. We would look as bad as the Nazis. There has to be, we have to follow legal form, and legal process. But how do we prosecute? How do we prosecute these women? The law that they were operating under, of course, was German law, which permitted them to do exactly what they had done. The rules under which they were going to be prosecuted were promulgated by the Allies after the acts themselves had occurred. So we have not only a problem that the law didn't apply to them, but it was an ex post facto law. And so unless there was this assumption that there had to be something transcendent, something more, something that undergirds the positive law of particular regimes and by which those laws can be measured, there really was no valid basis for prosecuting the Nazis. In natural law, the traditional foundation for that belief, that there is indeed a foundation, had been under assault for over 100 years in American law. I'm going to try to remember Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of our most famous justices, was an atheist, very skeptical man, very witty man, very brilliant man, but he'd have none of this religion or natural law business. And I'm going to paraphrase, but he wrote an article in the Harvard Law Review in 1908 where he said, it's a very close paraphrase, he said, the knights of romance require you to admit that their lady is not only the best lady that God ever made, but the best that God ever will make. And if you don't admit to that, you must fight. He said, it seems to me that the philosopher's pursuit of universal standards of legal validity fall under the same head as this sort of quest for certainty and perfection. In fact, he said, people who can't reach it otherwise simply get drunk. This is sort of the introduction of this law review. And Holmes he was very influential. I mean, he was, of course, not alone, but he was among the greatest of intellectuals on the Supreme Court and sort of rejecting these ideas of natural law. He very famously called natural law a brooding omnipresence in the sky. And so his spirit, that spirit, dominated for many decades. And yet by the time we get to 1946, the Allied prosecutors are forced to look for something beyond this sort of positivism. And when you read their closing arguments, they don't use the word natural law, but they talk in terms that are not just reminiscent of it. They're, natural law, these were terms by which they were really restating the natural law. They talked about transcendent standards. They talked about, they quoted the Nazis to the fact that Nazism was inconsistent with Christianity and how that itself indicts them. And they went on to sort of spell out their arguments in terms that are very reminiscent of the natural law. But again, they didn't want to use the term natural law. This has become, well, bad odor. So the general thesis that I'm unfolding or trying to argue for is that I think what we see, or what I've found at least, in looking back over the course of modern thought and politics, morality, and law, is an attempt increasingly to put new wine